Viv de chuvachai de shemecha, ki lo azalta de shechadonai, Adonai chavetz teman tzidko, yagdil taravi adir. Yitgada v'yitgada shemei rabba, v'amadi v'akirute, v'amlich machute, b'chayechon u'vyamechon, v'chayedecho be'Yisrael, b'agalav v'zman kariv, imu amen. Yehish mevarach, le'lam lamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitparach v'yitma v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yidele v'yidala shmer gudesha brichu le'elem in kol berchata v'shirata tishbata v'nechamata daman ba'alma v'imu amen. Vani tvilati lechadonai ad ratzon Elohim berov chastecha aneni bemed yishecha Vayehi bin Zaron vayomer Moshe Kumarana v'afutzoi v'echa v'yanusim esanecha mibanecha Ki mitzion tetzei Torah Dvar Adonai mirushalayim Baruch shenatan Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kdushato. Gadlu Adonai tiv Moshe B'olah yachdav le'Adonai milad
Adonai Eloheinu. Am I in the right place?
Yes, you're in the right place. Can I give you an aliyah? Or maybe you can wrap the Torah then? Yeah? We wrap the Torah and then leave it out.
For those in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, we're on page 769 with the beginning of the book of Numbers. If you're in any other book or Tanakh, it's on the first chapter of Bamidbar. 769.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai Mevarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. V'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'Ohel Moed b'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana hasheni litzei tamei eretz Mitzrayim lemor se'u et rosh kladat b'nei Yisrael lemishbechotam levet avotam b'mizpar shemot kol zachar legulgulatam mben 20 shana v'malach litzei tzava b'Yisrael tifkedu otam l'tzivotam atav Aharon. Vitechem you ish Vitechem you ish lamate ish rosh levet avotavu.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam natav tochenu. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
Bob, can I give you an aliyah? Yeah, why not? Let's do it. Ya'amud. Oh, be the Levi aliyah. Ya'amud, what's your hero name? Reuven ben Gershom, Visara, Lalia, Hashnia. Can you touch and kiss using this?
Page 770, verse 5.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Mevorach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch et Adonai. Baruch Adonai hamvorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch et Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. V'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Ve'ele shmot wanashim asher ya'amdu itechem L'Reuven Elitzur ben Shedeur L'Shimon Shlumiel ben Surishadai L'Yehuda Nachshon ben Aminadav L'Yisachar Netanel ben Suar L'Zvulun Eliyav ben Chelon Livnei Yosef L'Ephraim Elishama ben Amihud Limnashe Gamliel ben Betatzur Levinyamin Avidan ben Gironi Ledan Achiezer ben Amishadai Leasher Pagiel ben Ochran Legad Eliasaph ben Duel Lenaftali Achira ben Enan Ela Krue Hoida Nasieh Matot Avotam Rashe Alpha Yisrael Haim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam natan b'tochenu, Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah.
Amen.
Step over there. Shakoah.
Gosh.
Minha Amad. Ben Yisrael. Tuvia Yisrael. Ben Abraham. Eliva. Lalia Hashlishit.
Page 771, verse 17.
Baruch et Adonai hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Vayikach Moshe v'Aharon et wanashim ha'eleh asher nikbu b'shemot v'et kol ha'eda hikilu v'echad lachodesh hasheni v'yildu mishpuchatam levet avotam b'mispar shemot miben esrim shana v'mala l'guglotam ka'asher tziva Adonai et Moshe v'yifkadem b'midbar Sinai.
Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Ya Amod, Hamadia Ta'amod, Hamodelet. Invite you to rise as we lift and wrap the Sefer Torah. Let me share, yeah. Torah. First of all, is there anybody here in the room who has a male to be said this week? Is it the yard site this week of a relative? For anyone? No? Okay. Is there anyone on Zoom who has a yard site that's being observed this week? Looks like Tybal does. Tybal, could you tell us who this male is for? It might take a second to unmute. Give it a second. As soon as you're unmuted, we'll take the name and then I'll offer the male. Oh, she can't unmute. Okay. If there's a way for, can we try again? If Hector, if you're online or if somebody else is on there, if you could do your best to try to see if Tybal can unmute. Yeah, that's true because it's after Shabbat there. If you want to write the name in the chat, you can do that because you're somewhere on the East Coast. Oh yes, of course, because there's no chat, she can't chat. Okay, if there's an issue of unmuting, okay. If you can get unmuted later, we will still say the male. We'll continue with the service and we'll say the male. We can still say it even if we're here in the Torahs and the Ark. Okay, but if whoever is working on technical could try to get her unmuted, that would be helpful. We'll continue now, returning the Torah to the Ark. I'll give the Torah back to Alan, and
Yeah, hallelujah, Shem Adonai, Kinis Gashema Levado.
we'll continue now on page 222 with Chatzi Kaddish, followed by the whispered private Amidah.
יתגדע ויגדע שמי רבה, ברמדי והקיותי ובניך מלכותי בחייכון ובימיכון וחיידךו בישראל, בגלל בזמן קריב עמו, אמן. ישמי רבה ברך ללם למלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפרע וידמם ויתנשא ויתגדע וידלה וידלה שמי קודשה, ויראו לעילה מן גובך ושירתה, תושבתה ונחמתה דמן בעלמה ועמו, אמן.
If you haven't yet completed your private Amidah, please continue at your own pace. The repetition begins on page 223. We join together on 225 with the Kedusha, and after the Kedusha ends with Ha'el HaKadosh, we can be seated. Again, we're on 223.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Eloi Avotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzhak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachav Elohei Leah Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaNorah El Elyon Gomer Chasadim Tovim V'Konei Yaakov V'Zocher Chasdei Avot U'Mevi Goel Livnei V'Nehem L'man Shmo Be'ava Melech Ozer V'Ked Moshe Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham V'Ked Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechem Itav Rab L'Oshia Morid Atal Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed Mechem Itim B'Rachamim Rabim Samech Noflim V'Ofer Cholim U'Matir Asurim Mekayem Anato L'Shenei Avar Michamach Bar Gevorot U'Mido Melach Melech Me'Midom Chaim Atzmiach Yeshua V'Ne'eman Atal Achayov Beitim Baruch atah Adonai Mechayei HaMeitim Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam Geshem Shemakdishim Bato B'Shmei Marom Kekatuv Hayad Nevi'echa V'Kara Ze El Ze V'Amahar Kadosh, 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 Anai Tzvaro, Melech Haaretz Kvodo, L'matam Baruch Yomeru. Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimkomo, Divrei Kodshecha Katuv Lebo. Yimelech Adonai le'olam, Elohai Tzion, Ledor Vador, Hallelujah. Ledor Vador Nagid Godlecha, Lenetzach Nasim Kedushatcha Nakdish, V'shivchacha Eloheinu, Mipinu le'yomu shel elam va'ed, Ki o Melech Gadol v'Kadosh Ata, Baruch atah Adonai, Ha'el HaKadosh. אתה אחד ושמך אחד, ומכם חסר גוי אחד בארץ, תפארת גדולה, ועטרת ישועה, יום מנוחה קדושה למך נתת, אברהם יגר, יצחק ירנן, יעקב ובניו ינוחו בו, מנוחת אהבה ונדבה, מנוחת אמת ואמונה, מנוחת שלום ושלווה והשקט והבטח, מנוחה שלמה שאתה רוצה בה, יכירו בניך וידעו כי מעידך הוא מנוחתם, ועל מנוחתם יקדישו את שמך. אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, עצב מנוחתנו, קדשנו במצוותיך, ותן חלקנו בתורתך, סבנו בטובך, ושמחנו בישועתך, ותאר ליבנו לעבדך באמת, והנחילנו אדוני אלוהינו, באהבה ורצון שבת קודשך, ואנוכו ויעש במקדשי שמך, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש השבת. רצה אדוני אלוהינו, בעמך ישראל תפילתם, והשבת הדבר לדביר ביתך, ותפילתם בבת תקבל ברצון, ותהי לרצון, תמיד אדוני ישראל עמך, ותחזינה עינינו, ושובך לציון ברחמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, המחזיר שכינתו לציון, מודים אנחנו לך. הטוב כאילו לרחמך, ומרחם כאילו תמסדך, מעולם קיווינו לך. ועל כולם יתברך וירם שמך מלכנו, תמיד לעולם ועד. וכל הם יודוך סלע, ויעלו את שם האמת. האל שועתנו ועזרתנו סלע. ברוך אתה אדוני, הטוב שמך לחנך להודות. Shalom Rava Yisrael Amcha, V'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel Tasim Le'olam, Gatahu Melech Adon Lechol HaShalom, V'tov Beinecha, Levaret Amcha So B'chol Ed B'chol Shar B'Shlomecha, Baruch Atah Adonai, Habarech et Amo Yisrael B'Shalom. Tzidkatcha tzedek le'olam, u'toratcha emet, v'tzidkatcha Elohim ad marom, asher asita gedolot, Elohim michamocha, tzidkatcha b'are'el, mishpatecha tahom rahaba, Adam u'bema, toshia Adonai. Yitkadav Yikadash Shemerabah, Be'abad Yivakyu Tevam Nichma Chute B'chayechon U'yamechon V'chedocho Be'Yisrael, Ba'ilav Izman Karivimu, Amen. Yehi Shemerabah Barach Le'olam Elamei Omayam. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitbarach V'yitbarach V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalav Shemer Kedusha V'yiru Le'elam Min Koberchata V'shirata Tushbata V'nechmata Daman Ba'amavimu. Amen. Tidgabat Sodom V'chon D'chol Yisrael Kadam U'Mishmaya V'yimu. Amen. Yehi Shalom Min Shmaya V'chaim Alen V'chol Yisrael V'yimu. Amen. Ozeh Shalom Imamav Hu Yaseh Shalom Alen V'chol Yisrael V'yimu. Amen. Aleinu L'shabeach L'Adon HaKol. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יד אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי ואמליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם אלומי אומיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Amen. Yeshar Koach, Alan, for leading us in Mincha. Yeshar Koach, Marshall, on your reading the book of baby names that nobody's using anymore. all those names in the beginning of Bamidbar. We are going to take a little break to nourish ourselves, have a little Seudah Shalishit. So those who are in the room are going to go and grab a snack. Perhaps if you're watching from online, you will grab something to nourish yourself as well. And we'll join together in about 15 minutes or so. 14 maybe, I don't know. 13, we're negotiating now. You're a mediator, right? So in about 15 minutes or so, we'll join together for some learning about the sanctification of space vis-a-vis the curriculum of the Hartman Institute. So let's go have a bite, and then we'll join together shortly.
tuna and some olives? Why don't you come over here? Why don't you roll that away? And I'm gonna, where do you want to go? You want to get food? You want to go out? Hey, it's time to eat now. Hey, we're gonna eat. Yeah. Yes. You want? No, I'm good. I'm just saying if you.
5 or 6 tamales, you can actually take it.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. It's he can roll himself in it, which is great. It's just you have to hammer it. It's just it's hard to put in the car. That's what I love. We don't usually tend to use it, but you know when we're just walking here, yeah. I'm actually getting a light version. And that was easily intimidating. A lot of wheelchairs. They're part of the 5,000. I just never accessible. Wish it was some strawberries. I would have done just about anything. Wheels that go around.
Well, that's where he's
Very nice. Yeah. Very nice. It's so lovely. And us we were out there.
Fran.
They really are great for slightly far away.
And when Danny arrived, we have a history of it.
I thought it was so what was your summer like? No, very teary.
Going to Boston for a wedding.
Seriously, and she did a nice little spiel. It was actually only their day. It was actually quite lovely.
Wally.
That's such a good movie.
Yeah, that and the dog. You also.
I guess so. Buddy, come on over if you want to now.
Wally.
Wally song. Yeah, my name is Boston. And then we're gonna go to the
Great niece.
my first cousin wants to go.
Yeah,
My mom's from both my parents are from Boston. So I have a lot of friends. Oh, okay. We haven't had a sister in a while.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna Even if they had said you could come back, she would.
Done.
Left camp, done with the other.
Pack it up and go.
We would love for you.
Maybe it's like a camp, maybe it's some kind of staff position.
Yeah.
Staff.
Yeah.
Working in the gone.
Yeah.
Reading. You want some cream cheese? Yeah. It's Danny's last summer. 27.
Yeah, my last time was 09.
I'm tired. I'm ready, Danny. Better to have it next summer. What did I screw up these like a minute? Yeah, you did. Thank you. Called Haskell. It's in upstate New York.
Oh, okay, I've never heard of it.
I wouldn't work for it. Ezra's like,
But like locally and local ones. Yeah, you go home.
He's been working. He's been doing some of the other choices.
Why did I not know that?
They just announced it like a few days ago.
Oh, yeah. No, I've been supposed to plan a Shabbat dinner with Gary and Margaret like for months. I just found a whole video.
Oh, yeah.
Should pull that out.
Yeah. Benji's great. And I think it'll be really good for him. He's started going back and coming to president.
Age for that.
Yeah, he comes with him and then they just do on Thursday. What is that? What does she have to get up? He's working, he has another job. So he's like,
Right.
I really like it.
Like it. Really?
Yeah. I don't know how she knew it.
Yeah, I think they were in Elohim. They were in Vermont.
He was a music now.
Oh, he was?
Yeah.
It's funny about Ezra. It's just, everyone's got a balance on it.
Yeah, I feel like I can't tell if it's it feels like.
Do they know yet whether they're gonna be able to? Yeah.
Early development.
Root camp or they go?
Right.
Right. Yeah, sorry, it's that curiosity.
He does art and stuff there.
Yeah, we saw him at the yacht club.
He made a deal with business. I said, yeah, this is like a year and a half.
Wow. And he made his own deal?
Yeah, so I said, you can ask her. And she thought it was great that he contacted her. He worked it out. And you just said, he said,
Yes.
I think he feels like he's been doing that same thing for a while.
Yeah, it's kind of best in those situations to just not force the issue. It just makes it worse. Yeah. It sounds like airplanes.
It's not. It's a bad. It's actually not.
Oh, I should look at that.
I find that like you frustrating.
Which is more like what I've been doing.
Yeah.
Professionally and back at home, and I never got any benefit from lenses. I would interview a lot of, I mean, I have my own memoir, but most of it,
Yeah.
interview.
And that's what she does. I think
Yeah.
it's a really good model.
So then I should talk
You
about
know, really, like, almost she weaves in parts of her own life. I feel like
write everything down.
75% of it is not just
Right.
about the big
That's
picture.
exactly right.
So she
Because, you know,
uses her experience for what when you learn from it.
Yeah, because if you do memoir, then it becomes an experience of one.
Yeah.
I mean, and then either you should just write a real memoir, like, you know what I mean? Like, but if you're trying to write something that's really, you know, inspired, descriptive, then you really have to bring in an expert.
Yeah. So it's a good help. Yeah. I don't have it. I'm listening to you. I don't have
Real answers. I mean, you know, like, kind of, I mean, you need the right people and all that, but right money, having enough money helps you get the right people, the right support. I mean, especially middle class people. It's just so hard because people have spent so much out of pocket. You know, moms have already, so many of their moms either stopped working or stopped back out because they didn't have the jobs that were bringing enough money. You know, it makes sense to really hire somebody else. So by the time the kids come to it, there's not a lot of money left. Well, you asked to like review.
No, I read a novel called Stories That I Regret. I think someone said I should try. And when I heard about this murder on a podcast, talking about the book, and I looked at my email from that we had had this experience. And yeah, he's looking for more.
Hi, everybody. We're going to get started learning. Continue to nosh and enjoy. I'm really, I feel like it's such a blessing to have this package of great sources and thoughtful questions. So we're going to dive in to the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America's Foundations for a Thoughtful Judaism learning for this week. It's not particularly tied to the Parsha. So before we jump into the concept of the sanctification of space, I want to share with you one thing in studying Parshat Bamidbar, which I began doing this week in anticipation of next week's Hama'alot. I came across a beautiful teaching from Heschel, from God and Man. It's a thick teaching, a big quote. And essentially, the teaching is this. In Parshat Bamidbar, we have the instruction that B'nai Kahat, who are a class of religious leaders, are not allowed to re-enter the tent of meeting until all of the holy work that's being done in there has concluded. And what Heschel writes about this is that this is one of many instances in the entirety of Tanakh, but truly in Torah itself, when a great mystery, he uses a Latin phrase, I'm going to stay away from all of his difficult language, so hopefully you can swallow this late on a Saturday afternoon, evening. He says that the great mystery of the universe, which is essentially his way of talking about yirah, of awe, which we read as both amazement and also fear, that that amazement, that wondrousness of God becomes a barrier time after time for the Jewish people's closeness with God. We are instructed not to get too close to God. But he gets more specific. He says, it's not, though, in any of these instances, whether in Nadav and Avihu having brought strange fire and then having been zapped from the place in the temple where they were offering, or in the instance of the B'nai Kahat being forbidden here from approaching the tent of meeting. It doesn't seem, though you would think at first, that our being very close to God in space is the issue. It's being close to the vessels that are made to be holy and sacred instruments for God, that we are meant to be distanced and that we are meant to fear. That it's the actual instrumentation, that what we are warned to do in the course of the Torah is not technically to distance ourselves from the divine being, from this disembodied figure, but rather from the sacred spaces and the sacred vessels within those spaces, which are used for sacred worship of that divine being. I think that's a wonderful entry point into Hartman's curriculum about the sanctification of space, because it would be so easy to dismiss what we're about to learn as only applicable in spaces where God's self dwells therein. So I want to encourage you as we talk through all of these texts together and learn together, not to get caught up in the concept of whether or not you or any of the historical figures in our people actually achieved a personal closeness with God in those places, but rather encounters with the sanctity of God. And I have Heschel to back me up on that, okay? Now that I've given you the Heschel on this, that it's not about whether or not we've gotten too close to God's self, as in the warnings directly on Har Sinai, but rather, which we'll look at in a moment, but rather the warnings that we shouldn't even get too close sometimes, and yet we have to get close sometimes within sacred spaces. So that's our backdrop. That's my preface and my framing. I'm going to pass these out. Hopefully those of you who are joining us virtually or after the fact will find that source sheet that we sent out. I didn't make too many copies because I like the colors. Okay. Right. Hopefully, in just a moment, we will have time to go through all 5 texts. That's my hope, is that we're actually going to get through all 5 of these texts. Now, don't look into the text just yet. I'm going to give you the overview. These texts are arranged in the order in which they appear in our canon, in our Jewish sacred texts as they've been canonized, but they also have a different progression to them, because we're going to talk about an encounter with a sanctified space that takes place without any human input. And then without any human input. And then we're going to talk about the construction of sacred spaces. And then we're going to talk about the exchange of God and humanity in all of those sacred spaces. And finally, hopefully we get to this last and fifth and last text, that there's purpose to those sacred spaces, particularly the ones that are constructed. So we start in the Torah, not in the Parsha. That's why I gave a little Parsha bite, but we start instead back in Shemot. So I encourage you to open up to source number 1. Just as in the last class, if you joined for that or heard after the fact, we talked about the sanctification of time in the course of the original template, which was Shabbat. That's the sanctification of time. This class begins with the original biblical template for sanctifying space, which is Mount Sinai. That's the original template given to us by the Torah. So I'm going to encourage you to consider, based on your own interpretation, what this chapter in Shemot in Exodus teaches about the meaning of sacred space. And this particular passage that we're looking at is a discussion of a conversation that took place between Moshe and God. Moshe being the one who had the closest relationship, per the narrative voice of the Tanakh, with God of all of the named prophets that we get in our tradition. So let's get to the text. Text number 1. It's on page 37 because this is from a large packet. If you're looking for the number on it, it's class 3, the Sanctification of Space, source 1. So Shemot, chapter 19, verses 20 to 23. So, Vai Yered Adonai al Har Sinai. God came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called to Moses to the top of the mountain. And Moses went up. I love this section because it's a lot of going down and going up, a lot of directionality, which is a parallel. By the way, I encourage you to look into parallelisms with this and the ladder and Jacob's dream of the ladder. There's beautiful parallels. Okay. You're okay? Yeah? Okay, great. As long as Danny's okay. Yeah. Okay, great. So God says something to Moses once. So God comes down to the mountain. Moses goes up to the mountain, and God says to Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, because lest they might perish." The priests also, V'gam HaKohanim, here's our first instruction to the priests not to get too close. So the priests also who come near to God, they have to stay pure lest the Lord break out against them. He frotz bahem. But Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it.' Ki ata ha'edota banu." You caused us to be aware of this situation of boundaries. Lemor, saying, "Hagabel et hahar." Make a, what does that sound like? Hagabel? Gavul. Good. Excellent. So you heard it ringing out, that idea of a gavul. And this idea of hasagat gavul is the idea of crossing over a boundary. So Moshe is now quoting God back to God. Says, "Wait a minute, you said we weren't supposed to get too close. You also instructed us to sanctify it," in the same breath. Okay, so this is the conversation that they have. So the Torah is describing God as coming down to Mount Sinai, and already we have a sense, as I mentioned in that Bamidbar text, that there might be some danger that lurks in a space that has God in it. God doesn't want the people to break through to see God, doesn't want the priest to do the same thing, worried about the priests remaining pure. And Moshe goes on and quotes God and further describes the mountain as holy and says it shouldn't be visited. So what's the significance of divine revelation that's taking place in a specially designated place? Why is it important that this revelation take place in a specially designated place? Is it important? Does the text tell us? I think this is a meta question, right? The text doesn't say, and Har Sinai is a very special place. It's a meta question. Deborah, did you have a thought? Right.
And then what does that even mean? I mean, if God came down on the top of the mountain, you would think someone other than Moshe would have noticed that already because they were sort of close.
Sure. So Deborah's pointing out that part of the dialogue that's going on here seems to reveal, speaking of revelation, that God's self may be torn about how close God is ready to have the people or the priests to God. God isn't sure, it seems, because Moshe has to say, wait, didn't you say we weren't supposed to get too close? And so there's a little bit of a tug of war going on, perhaps internally, to the divine presence. What do you think, just looking at that very end there, where Moshe is quoting this idea, that ki dashto, and sanctify it, what do you think holiness means here? How does this meaning of holiness relate to other meanings of kedusha, of sanctity, that we've seen elsewhere? What is sanctity as it's defined here, b'kidashto? Yeah.
Not good at that, but it seems like this is the starting point. That's really what it means. That's really what sanctifies. This is where it starts. This is the origin. This is the beginning. And all this drama, it's drama, but it emphasizes the beginning.
So, Bob, you're right. It does seem like there's an imbued sanctity to this moment from our vantage point as readers. Like, I don't know where the sanctity is coming from, but I see this moment between Moshe, God, and we know what's coming, revelation to the Jewish people. And I think, that's a holy moment. I'm not sure what else is holy, but that is. But here in the text, and just to challenge that idea, it seems like the people have a role in that sanctity because, as Moshe reminds God, there's a command from God that we should stay back and sanctify the place. Do you have a thought? Okay, so as Jason is pointing out, the concept here seems to be that the absence of impure humanity makes for the sanctity of the space. It seems like that distance may even be causal in this sentence, right? Keep yourselves beyond a gavul, back behind some sort of a boundary, and perhaps therefore, in parentheses, it will be a sacred space. You will sanctify it by staying back from it. Do you know what this makes me think of? My dad is a lover of amateur architecture, and it raised me to love the history of American architecture, particularly craftsman homes, because we lived in San Diego. He took me all over Los Angeles. I love it. And part of appreciating the history of architecture is understanding the evolution of different rooms in the home. And one of the things that goes through a bit of a sine wave throughout time is this idea that in our home, there ought to be a living room or a sitting room that we shouldn't enter. Who here grew up with parents or a grandparent who had a room you weren't supposed to go into? I had that in my own house. We got a lot of here's in the room here, and I imagine some of you who are watching virtually as well. Hey, that's what this makes me think of. Like, okay, there's gonna be a living room. There's a statue in there you're definitely gonna break. Don't know why we let the grandkids over with it, right? And there seems to be this idea, I'm not sure if it exactly translates, but I like the concept that perhaps the idea of the space remaining sacred because we don't go into it, that I can get. When I think about those very special rooms that we only went in on very special occasions, right? That people don't go into it. Now, the Gen Xers and millennials rather famously rebelled against this, even some boomers, because it really came from the greatest generation. That was the last sine wave where we had living rooms. This is not a lecture on architecture, but we rebel against the idea, right? We rebel against the concept that there's a space we're not supposed to go into, because wouldn't you think that what makes a space great are the people in it. And that is a tug of war that we have when we have spaces that we love and places that we love. I want us to go right on to the next text, which is on page 38 in the packet, source number 2. And like I gave you a little bit of a primer on, this is now going to move us to talking about sacred spaces that humanity did have a hand in making. Right? We didn't make Har Sinai. Har Sinai got designated by dint of the fact that a miracle happened there. But here we have a different text, right? Yes, Marshall.
Can I just ask one question about two words which are here in verse
Sure.
22, Yikadashu, and 23, Yidash.
Yes.
You translate it as holy. It doesn't really mean separate. Because here it says, set a boundary about the mountain and keep it separate. And even here, the priests who come near the Lord, here it's translated, must stay pure. They should say separate.
Right. So Marshall is contending that the text, when it's using Kof Dalid Shin in these latter verses here, that we're talking about sanctity through the word separation. Shouldn't it even be translated as kept separate? Now, there are a couple of answers I can give to you. One is many people absolutely translate Likhadesh as a conception of sanctifying by means of setting aside. And I gave a whole Josh on that a couple weeks ago, actually. So I guess I'm among them. But secondarily, I'll say those who would challenge that notion and would translate this as its own thing would say, we have a separate verb, in fact, several that talk about separating out. Lehavdil and some others as well that are more complex in the Torah itself. And so the question is, what is this, if not Havdel, if not a differentiation, what is this? It must be, I would argue, some sort of thing that means differentiation plus elevation. There's something to Likadesh that's a separating out. And the best word that we have in the English language, really from Latin, is sanctification. But you're right that sanctification itself might be defined as a separating out for the purpose of ritual elevation. That would be my way of talking about it and translating it. It's a yes and to that question. And a lot of people wrestle with that concept of sanctity really just being a setting apart for sacred purpose, for a special purpose. Yeah, Fran.
And there are certain works that have velvet ropes and markers that don't allow you to get close.
Sure. So there's this idea that there are in museum spaces works that are so delicate or perhaps so precious would be the way of maybe that's another nice translation of it, like precious in a religious sense, that we actually designate out by velvet rope or some other designation that we cannot get close to that thing. Here, what makes sanctification of a space so complicated, and this is the perfect transition into our having created a sacred space as human beings, is that there may or may not be an obvious practical implication. If I can't get close to the Mona Lisa, I might think they're worried I'm going to steal it. They're worried I'm going to touch it. They're worried I'm going to take photography and like the flash will go off and that sort of a thing is an issue. But here, there might be no sense to it. In fact, it might seem contradictory to God's desire to bring us close, to go back to Deborah's idea, right? Like, wouldn't you want to? If I wanted to carry this further into the metaphor that you've created, it would be like as if the artist or the curators in many cases would say, I really want people to be able to see the texture up close and the colors and the wonderful things and appreciate it, but also please don't get close. Right. So there is a back and a forth there. I think it's a great image, though, as well, Fran. Even if we don't have that image from an individual home, it's this precious thing that we're trying to stay away from it. And that the notion of preciousness or sanctity is something that we derive, like Bob was saying, from seeing it set aside. oh, Moshe said we're not supposed to go close to this mountain. This mountain must be special, right? Or, oh gosh, that painting seems to have many alarms and guards around it. It must be special. So it teaches us as well. Source number 2 takes us about 6 chapters later into Shmot, where we quickly move into the concept that we need to have a dwelling place for God when we're not sitting there at Har Sinai or standing there at a distance from Har Sinai. God spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel so that they take from me an offering from every person whose heart is willing. Shall you take my offering?" I actually wrote a song about this verse for my interview weekend here at Temple Beth Am. So that was like 9 years ago that I wrote a song. It's a great verse because it speaks to so many different aspects of sanctity, and also that the directions once again are not coming directly from God, but from Moshe to Bnei Israel. They should take an offering from every person whose heart is willing, and then this is the offering that you should take from them. And then they list all the different types of metals and materials that should be listed. And we're going to skip down to verse 7. Onyx stones and stones to be set for the ephod and the breastplate. So we're learning what are some of these things going to be used for. And then v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. And let them, they shall make for me a mikdash. Now we have it in a nounal form. V'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell among them. It's a few questions, but very short questions. We can get to all our texts. Why would people build a building for a God who is not corporeal? Because perhaps in that place, you can still feel God, even if it's not physical. Perhaps there's a metaphysicality to it that we bring. We seem to be instructed that if you build it, they will come, right? God will come, to quote a great movie. So might be consequential here, and might be consequential. And I will dwell among them if they should make for me a place that is mikdash. But why? Joey, do you have an idea? So God's presence can be felt anywhere, says Joey. So it can't be just for God's presence. What else could it be for? Right? What else could it be for, man? The neighbors. So like Keruv. Like it's the Chabad tent, right? And it's Or Lagoyim, we're a light to the nations. Great. If you want to have more followers, you probably want to have a building. And I'm going to derive from that concept that that part of what you're saying and a little bit of what Rachel's saying is this concept of the sanctuary place being for our sake. I'm open to pushback on that concept, but so far as I can see it, so far we are making a mikdash for the sake of God dwelling, but that does seem ultimately to be for the sake of humanity. Tom, and then Jason, and then I'll move around.
So that's a place where God will dwell. Because them means that we're gathering there. It's not
Good.
just a structure. It's a place where people will gather.
Great. So Tom is saying any individual perhaps can experience God wherever they go, or maybe in particular places, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a mikdash made by people. But if you want people to be doing this God sacred work together, if you want to experience God cohortatively, if you want to experience it in a group, you got to experience it in a place that's set aside for that. So we're setting aside a place so that we can do it in a group. Fascinating. And I like that concept. Yeah.
sacred and unsacred, and you're writing point of focus.
Okay, so Jason is helping us understand, thinking about, first of all, the chapters in the text and how they proceed, and also thinking about the way that our human minds can conceive of God and God worship, that this was the next natural step in the course of the narrative of the Jewish people. Am I getting that idea right? We were at Har Sinai, we had the mountain, and then, perhaps a few people raised their hand and said, so at some point, are we leaving this place? And if we do, is God coming with us? Because that's a real raw question. You have burning insights or questions you want to add, or can we move on to the next text? What do you think? Can we go to the next text? Great. So let's go to source number 3. First book of Kings. We're going to keep digging into this notion of the human container for God. Now we've moved into the Tanakh part of Tanakh. But will God truly dwell on earth? Great question to start with. But will God truly dwell on earth? Behold, the heavens, the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet attend to the prayer and supplication of your servant, O Lord my God, to hearken to the cry and prayer which your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open toward this house day and night, towards the place of which you said, my name shall be there, Shemi Sham, to hearken to the prayer which your servant shall pray towards this place. And hear the supplication of your servant and your people Israel when they shall pray towards this place, El Makom, here in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. If a person sins against one's neighbor and obliges their neighbor in an oath, causing them to swear, and that person comes and swears before your altar in this house, we're going to do one more verse, here in heaven, and do and judge your servants, condemning the wicked to bring their way upon their own head, and justifying the righteous, given them according to their righteousness. So, would you say that this seems to fit into Jason's notion of a progression of going from a mountain to what was the Mishkan? It's like a pack and fold, the pack and play, the pop-up. Very good. I like that. The pop-up tent version to a dwelling place, and it's going to be this place, and you're going to come to this place, and you're going to go to this place, and it's going to be a central location where people are going to come to pray. We're going to hop quickly to the Tosefta. I would love to dwell on the king's piece, but I like the dad jokes of Jewish. It's the epitome of Jewish nerddom. We're going to go to page 42 and get through the Tosefta. It might be the last text we get to. We'll see if we get a little further. To this point, we stress the significance of holy space for connecting God and human beings to one another. But in the next 2 sources, at least this one that we'll get to, we've got to talk about the social dimensions of what holy space can accomplish. So both of these sources are post-biblical, and they were penned by ancient rabbis. They lived in a different religious milieu than we do, but they maintained their imagination, even as they're talking about this, about the importance of the site of the temple. Right? They hadn't lost sight of the site of the temple, but here they were trying to imagine the social benefits of having such a place. Okay. This is the Tosefta. Depends on who you ask, but either parallel or earlier text to let's see, it's about 200 CE probably or so, just to give you some historical context. Those that are standing outside of the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards the land of Israel, and only then pray, as it is said, and those that pray to you by the way of their land, etc. Those that are standing in the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards Jerusalem, and only then pray, as it's said, and they'll pray to God by way of the city that you've chosen. Those that are standing in Jerusalem should direct their hearts towards the temple, as it's said, and they should pray towards their house. And those that are standing in the temple should direct their hearts to the Kodesh Kodeshim, to the Holy of Holies, and only then pray, And then they give another proof text from that same place in Kings. It comes out that all of those standing in the north will be facing the south. All of those standing in the south will be facing the north. All of those standing in the east will be facing west. And all of those standing in the west will be facing the east. And it will come out that all of the Jewish people will be praying towards one place. Yeah, Joel.
I have a question about directing their heart.
Yes.
You're standing, you put on you direct your heart.
Yes.
Does that mean I should physically face east, or does that mean a kavanah that my direction of my mind should be in Israel, no matter which way I happen to physically be facing?
Great question. So Joel says, does that mean that I have to physically move myself, or does kiven et libo mean like direct your heart as in my intentionality is directed towards, is it physical or not? I'm not going to give you a perfect answer. I'm just going to give you a funny answer because you're Joel. So my grandfather, alav shalom, lived till almost 103 years old. And when I asked him, you know, when we were discussing this idea of the Maizmanim app, you know, this idea that we're so precise about the times that we have nowadays, he used to say, like, what do you think we did back in 1928, you know, when I was a kid? What do you think we did when it came to knowing the exact time? Which I'll translate to, what do you think we did when we didn't have a compass exactly with us at the time? What do we do? You know, you do your best, kiven et libo. And I think it contains both those possibilities, both that we maybe ought to, and there is more discussion in the Talmud on that. But here I'm answering just if the Tosefta were to stand alone, that yeah, maybe it means direct your body, but if you didn't know, at the very least, the text specifically says kiven et libo. Rather than raise more discussion, since I want us to get to the last source, I want to share with you an insight that I love from whoever prepared this beautiful packet, which is, I think we all understand this idea that there is unity, kind of like Tom described the unity of being in one tent. There's a great deal of unity in the idea globally that we could all be facing one another in the same direction. I like this idea, though, that we transcend the concept of simply all of us directing ourselves towards the same place, and that we're actually directing ourselves towards each other. I'd never quite thought of it in that way before, but what an extraordinary thing that Jews all over the world, by means of trying to direct themselves to an umbilical place on the planet, are directing themselves towards each other as well. It would be a really nice concept to end on, but I want to look at the very last source, and then we'll say Birkat Hamazon. So it was taught by Rabbi Yehuda, whosoever did not see the double colonnade of Alexandria in Egypt did not see the glory of Israel. And then he goes on to describe just how gorgeous it was. I'm going to hop to the middle of it. And there was a wood bema in the middle, and the cantor of the gathering would stand upon it with kerchiefs in his hands that they could follow him. And when it reached the time to answer Amen, he would wave his kerchief, and the whole nation would answer Amen. And they would not sit mixed, but goldsmiths by themselves, and silversmiths by themselves, and glassblowers by themselves. And when a pauper would enter, he would recognize his fellow skilled men and head there, and from there his sustenance and that of his household would come. So I want us to end on this notion that builds on the concept of Jews all looking at one another, which is that since the concept of a sacred space has been around, the Jewish people have believed that part of the sanctity of that space is the way that people use that space to practically help their neighbors by giving them a lift. There are other texts that speak to other ways in which temple spaces and Mishkan spaces also became places to acknowledge, for example, those who were grieving. Some of you might know that particular source, that there was an entrance for those who were in mourning, and in that way, there were people who could be acknowledged by one another. This text, to me, adds to that notion that the synagogue has never just been a place to ignore the human beings in there and around there, and just to go inside and just kiven et libo al Hashem, to just direct yourself towards God. It has always been a place where we come together to take care of each other. And I think that that's a part of the designation of the sanctity of that space. I wish we had another hour or two to discuss this. It's worthy of it. But we're going to stop there so that we can say Birkat Hamazon. I rarely eat a bagel, but I did because it was so late. So I'm going to take the microphone to lead us in a little Shir Hamalo. You can open up your benchers to page 70 something. Joey's going to tell me. 47, that's what it was. Thank you, Joey. Shir HaMalav B'Shuv Adonai Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kecholim Az Yimale Zichok Binu U'Shoninu Rina Az Yomru V'Goyim Yigdil Adonai La'asoti Meileh Yigdil Adonai La'asoti Mainu Hayinu Selechim Shuv Adonai Shevitinu Kafikim Ba'Negev Hazorim Be'dima Berina Yiksoru Halach Yalechu Lacho Noshem Meshech Hazara Bo Yavo Berina no say Alumotav. Havirai Nevarech. Yisham Adonai Nevarach Mitav Yadolam Bershut Chavarai Nevarech Aleinu Shechal Numishalom. Baruch Aleinu Shechalnu Mishalom Tuvo Chayinu Baruch V'Shemo Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Hazan et Haolam Kulo B'Tuvo L'Chaim V'Chesed U'Rachamim U'Noten Lechem L'Chol Basar Ki Le'Olam Chasto U'Tuvo Tamid Lachasar Lanu V'Yachsar Lanu Mazon Le'olam Avad Bavur Shemo Agadol Yihozanu Farnes Lakol U'Metiv Lakol U'Metli Mazon Chol Eriyotav Baruch atah Adonai Azan et hakol. Migdol Yeshua Malka ve'osech eselim shicha leDavid ozaro ad olam osei shalom bimromav uyasei shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru amen. We're going to move now into Mariv for Chol for the regular day. Did somebody here want to claim leading it? I'm happy to lead it, but I know there are other people with obligations, etc. All right, I will lead. So we will begin on page 264. And I'll invite you to rise, if you're able, for Baruch Hu, after which you can be seated. We're on page 137 in Slim Shalom and page, I used to know this, 264? Yeah? 264, all right. Okay, confirmation. והוא רחום יחבר בו ולא ישחית, וירבה לישיבה בו ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני הושיע מלך יעננו, היום קוראנו, ברכו את אדוני המבורך. Baruch Adonai Amvorach Leolam Vahed. You can be seated. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Mavir Yom Hu Mevi Laila Mavdil Ben Yom Mevi Laila Adonai Tzvaot Shemo El Chai V'Kayam Tamid Imloch Aleinu Leolam Vahed. Baruch Atah Adonai Amari Varavim. Atolam Betusim. V'ahavat Echal Tasir Miminu Leolamim. Baruch Atah Adonai Ohev Amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu. Adonai Echad. Adonai Elohechem Emet. Malchuto b'ratzon gimelul lehem Moshe, u'v'nei Yisrael lechanu shira, besimcha rabba v'meru chulam. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar ba'kodesh, nora tehilot osefele. Melchutecha ra'uvanecha bogeyam livnei Moshe, zeili anu v'yameru, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. ונאמר כיפת אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. ושמור צדק וברינו לחיים ושלום יתה ביד עולם, ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל עד. ברוך אדוני לעולם עמי וימי ברוך אדוני מציון שכינו שלום אביו. כי המלכות שלך היא ומיה תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה. ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ויאמר יברך ירצה וימליך מלכותי, וחייכון ומלכון חיי תוכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי. יתברך וישתבח ויתבר ויתרמה ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילמים כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירם בהמה במהרו. Amen. The whispered private Amidah begins on 270. If you haven't yet completed your own private Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We're on 279. Hikadav, hikadash mirabah, v'yamati v'rakir tevim lich malchutei b'chayechon v'mechon v'chayducho beit Yisrael. Bagalach v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yeshemei rabah v'varach li'alam alon me'al maya. Yitbarach v'shabach v'ipar v'shama v'itnaseh v'italev v'ita. Hadar v'italev v'talal shemei dekudesha b'ri huleila. Minko berchata v'shirata. Trish berchata v'nechamata damiram behama. Vimru amen. You can be seated. We're in the middle of 279. Hikreini v'nehu imo anuchi v'sara, achaletzehu v'achvatehu, orech yamim asviehu, v'erehu b'shuati, orech yamim asviehu, v'erehu b'shuati. Turn back to page 216 if you're in Lev Shalem. Second paragraph on the page. V'yata kadosh Shefti lo Yisrael v'karazel zevi hamar, kadosh 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 Adonai tzvot meloch al haaretz kevodo. ותישאיני רוח ושמע אחרי כל רעש גדול, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ברוך רבינו. ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך כי לא אספת דורשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה ויאדיר. Turn back to Kaddish Shalem on page 280. Yikatav, Yikadash Mirabah, Yamati Rakir, Tevim Lich Malchutei b'chayechon v'mechon v'chayducho beit Yisrael. Vagalach v'zman karivim ru amen. Yeheshem hei rabah b'varach li'olam u'lamei maya. Yibarach v'shabach v'yipar v'shama v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalei v'yitalal shemei dekudesha. V'erichu leila min kol berchata v'shirata. Tush berchata nechamata damiram behama v'imru amen. Tikabat zloton uton dechol Yisrael karam v'hodi v'shmaya v'imru amen. Shlam harabah v'shemaya v'chaim alinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom alinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Before alinu, we turn to page 63 towards the beginning of the Siddur. I believe yesterday was 42. Did I get that right? Jackie Robinson's Omer Day. So we're going to count one more. Hineni muchana umzumenet lekayem mitzvat aseh shel svirata omer kemo shekatuv batorah usvartem lachem mimocharat Shabbat miyom aviachem et omer hatnufa sheva Shabbatot mimot tichena ad mimocharat Shabbat hashvi'it tisperu chamishim yom baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sfirat ha-omer. Baruch atah Adonai. Hayom Shlosha va'arbaim Yom Shehem Shisha Shavuot V'yom Echad La Omer. Way to count. We're just calling off different, like whoever had number 43. Yes, okay. Page 281, Aleinu. Aleinu l'shaveach l'adon hakol, l'tekedu l'atlis every shisha. Kakatu b'tor techa Adonai himloch le'olam ba'ed v'nehmar v'haya Adonai l'melech kol haaretz v'yom ahu yichei Adonai echad u'shmo echad. Mourner's Kaddish is on 282. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabbah Be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתשמם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. הנה אל ישועתי, אפתח ולא אפחד, כי עוזי וזמרת אדוני ויהי לי לישועה, ושבתם מים בששון, מעיני הישועה, לאדוני הישועה. על עמך ברכתך סלה, אדוני צבאות עמנו, משכב לנו אלוהי יעקב סלה, אדוני צבאות, אשרי אדם בוטח בך, אדוני הושיע, המלך יעננו וימכרנו ליהודים הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון ניכר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות אשא, ובשם אדוני אקרא, יין אדוני יין Savri Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei besamim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei meorei ha'esh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshesh ben Yisrael la'amim, ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshet tamei hamaseh. Baruch atah Adonai, hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. Atoteinu imcho, zarheinu v'chaspeinu yarbe yarbe kacho, v'hakochavim alayla. Zarheinu v'chaspeinu yarbe yarbe kacho, v'hakochavim alayla. Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishvi. Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimnira liyamenu, Yavo Eleinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David. A reminder to everybody before we say a Getavach that tomorrow morning Shacharit is at 8 a.m. And then Monday morning, because it's a federal holiday, it's also at 8 a.m. And then on Tuesday morning, as we announced this morning, it will be Rosh Chodesh, so we're back to 7:15. So and keep an eye on the clock in your calendar. And Shavua Tov, everybody.
What about Yerushalayim?
Chag Sameach. Today is Yom Yerushalayim. Tomorrow is Yom Yerushalayim. It begins this evening, and it's a celebration of a victory that that has allowed us to, so many of us in this room and so many on our virtual platforms too. I've had the privilege of being able to be in Yerushalayim and to truly be in Yerushalayim. And we pray for a Yom Yerushalayim someday, Bimhera v'yameinu, soon in our days, where peace is entirely upon us and upon Jerusalem. Shavua Tov, everybody. What's that? Exactly. You have to pray for even this Yom Yerushalayim to be peaceful.
Shalush, love Yerushalayim.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Good to see you, Dan. Hey, what are we gonna have with Johnny?
Yaakov is going to be at Milan in Canada.
I know, isn't that crazy? That is so crazy. Super looking forward to it. Yeah. Hopefully I'll get up there to visit. Oh yeah, the first, going up for first session because my niece is going for her first session. Oh my god. So I'm gonna visit her. You have other family? Just her right now. Ella could have gone for Shorashim this summer, but I'm gonna send her next summer. Shorashim is like going into second grade and go for like 3 days or something. She was not ready for that. That's new. Yeah, and so now we're gonna. I haven't heard of Shorashim. It's a whole new thing. Is it new this year? I think they did it right before